The hospital is a temple of trust. We surrender our weakest, most vulnerable selves to its care, believing in the Hippocratic Oath, in the competence and compassion of the strangers in scrubs. We trust them with our lives. For over 16 years, in nearly a dozen hospitals across 2 states, a man named Charles Cullen weaponized that trust. He was not a monster who lurked in shadows. He was a dedicated nurse, working double shifts, often quiet, always present. He was also one of the most prolific serial killers in American history, with a confirmed body count of 29 and an estimated toll that may exceed 400. His weapon of choice was not a gun or a knife, but something far more insidious, the very medications meant to heal. Charles Cullen was born on February 22, 1960, in West Orange, New Jersey, the youngest of 8 children. His childhood was steeped in tragedy and instability. His father, a bus driver and mechanic, died when Charles was 7 months old, reportedly after falling from a bus. Later, it was revealed he had likely committed suicide. His mother died in a car accident when he was 17, though Cullen would later tell conflicting stories, sometimes claiming she had burned to death in front of him. He joined the Navy right out of high school, serving as a sonar technician on the USS Woodrow Wilson, a ballistic missile submarine. It was a high-stress environment, and Cullen did not thrive. He attempted suicide twice during his service and was honorably discharged in 1984 after being diagnosed with adjustment disorder with depressed mood. Returning to New Jersey, he seemed to find a direction. He enrolled in the Mountainside Hospital School of Nursing, driven, he would later say, by a desire to help people after the helplessness he felt watching his mother die. He graduated in 1987 and began his career at St. Barnabas Medical Center in Livingston, New Jersey. On the surface, he was a competent, if quiet, caregiver. He worked long hours, often volunteering for the overnight shifts nobody else wanted. He was a divorced father of 2, struggling to make child support payments, a man who seemed defined by his grim dedication to his work. But beneath the surface, a profound darkness was stirring. In 1988, just a year into his career, a 68-year-old Jesuit priest recovered from heart surgery suddenly crashed and died. No one could explain it. A few months later, a 91-year-old woman also died unexpectedly. The pattern had begun. Cullen's method was chilling in its simplicity and audacity. He exploited the inherent chaos of a hospital's intensive care unit. Patients in the ICU are critically ill. Deaths are not uncommon. Cullen used this as his camouflage. His primary weapon was digoxin, a drug derived from digitalis, used to treat heart conditions. In precise, therapeutic doses, it strengthens the heartbeat. In excess, it slows the heart to a fatal stop. It was the perfect murder weapon. The symptoms of a digoxin overdose arrhythmia, dizziness, nausea mimic the natural decline of a very sick patient. Unless a doctor specifically ordered a test for digoxin levels, which was rare and expensive, the poisoning would almost certainly go undetected. Cullen would gain access to the automated drug dispensing cabinets and med stations unlocked with a code or fingerprint meant to track narcotics. He would withdraw drugs like digoxin, potassium chloride, which can stop the heart, or insulin, which can cause fatal hypoglycemia. He would then inject a lethal dose into a patient's foreline. The entire process took seconds. He would later dispose of the evidence, syringes, vials in the myriad hazardous waste bins that litter a hospital floor. His motives, as he later described them to investigators, were murky and contradictory. He sometimes claimed he was practicing a form of mercy killing, ending the suffering of patients he deemed too far gone. Yet, many of his victims were on the path to recovery. He also spoke of the immense power it gave him, the control over life and death. He described the act as a compulsion, a way to alleviate his own bottomless anguish and rage. "I thought I couldn't be stopped," he would later say. The hospital, a place of healing, became his hunting ground, and death his perverse relief. The horrifying pattern continued as Cullen moved from hospital to hospital. He was a wanderer, never staying in one place for too long. Between 1987 and 2003, he worked at 9 hospitals and 1 nursing home in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. And at nearly every one, people grew suspicious. St. Barnabas Medical Center, 1987 to 1992, after a cluster of mysterious deaths and a higher-than-normal usage of digoxin, hospital administrators grew concerned. They could not pin anything on Cullen, but his behavior was odd. They eventually fired him for poor performance and, notably, ordered him to undergo a psychological evaluation. They did not contact the police. Warren Hospital, 1993 to 1996. Here, the pattern intensified. Colleagues nicknamed him the Angel of Death because so many patients died on his shift. A pharmacist noticed he was accessing patient records of people who weren't under his care and withdrawing drugs he had no reason to use. The hospital launched an internal investigation. They found his behavior suspicious and unusual, but their primary concern was liability. They forced him to resign in 1996, giving him a neutral recommendation to avoid a lawsuit. They, too, did not call the police. Somerset Medical Center, 2001 to 2002. This is where the walls finally began to close in. After a series of unexplained deaths, particularly in the critical care unit where Cullen worked, a team of clinicians, doctors, nurses, and pharmacists began a secret investigation. They noticed a direct correlation between Cullen's shifts and patient fatalities. They also discovered he had been conducting unauthorized searches of patient records. The hospital, terrified of scandal and lawsuits, tried to build an airtight case before going to the authorities. They restricted his computer access and monitored his every move. This was the devastating, recurring theme of the Cullen case: institutional self-preservation. Hospitals, fearing ruinous lawsuits, media firestorms, and shattered reputations, chose to quietly usher a suspected killer out the door rather than sound the alarm. They treated him not as a potential criminal, but as a human resources problem. With each hushed dismissal, Charles Cullen was handed a new license to kill. In October 2003, the secret team at Somerset Medical Center had finally seen enough. They contacted the Somerset County Prosecutor's Office. 2 detectives were assigned to the case: Tim Braun, a methodical and relentless investigator, and Danny Baldwin, his partner. They faced a daunting task. How do you investigate a murder that leaves no visible trace, committed in a place where death is routine? They had no crime scene, no murder weapon, no witnesses. All they had was a pattern and a suspect. Their break came from an unlikely source: the drug dispensing machines. Braun and Baldwin obtained the audit trails from the Pyxis machines Cullen used. These digital logs recorded every transaction: which nurse accessed which drawer, at what time, and which drug they withdrew. Poring over the data, they found a shocking pattern. Cullen was repeatedly withdrawing drugs, particularly digoxin and insulin, for patients who had no prescriptions for them. He was wasting drugs, a process where unused medication is documented and disposed of, at an astronomical rate, often with another nurse signing as a witness. The detectives theorized he was using these waste signatures to cover his tracks, injecting the lethal dose and then having a colleague sign off that he had dumped it. It was compelling circumstantial evidence, but it wasn't enough for an arrest. They needed a body. They exhumed the body of a 68-year-old monk, Father Florian Gall, who had died unexpectedly at Somerset after a routine treatment for pneumonia. Toxicology tests on his remains revealed a massive, lethal level of digoxin, a drug he had never been prescribed. Charles Cullen was arrested on December 12, 2003, and charged with 1 count of murder and 1 count of attempted murder. In custody, Cullen was initially silent, but detectives Braun and Baldwin used a careful, non-confrontational strategy. They presented him with the overwhelming evidence and appealed to his twisted sense of ego and his stated desire to provide closure for the families. Over several days of interrogation, he began to talk. He confessed to killing as many as 40 patients. But as the investigation widened across New Jersey and Pennsylvania, the number grew. He would later plead guilty to killing 29 patients and attempting to kill 6 others. However, he hinted that the true number was far higher, perhaps over 400, spread across his entire 16-year career. Without definitive proof, the full extent of his carnage will never be known. His reasoning remained elusive. He spoke of the stress of the job, of his own depression, of a desire to end suffering. But prosecutors argued it was about playing God. "He had the power of life and death," said one, "and he used it." To avoid the death penalty, Cullen agreed to cooperate with investigators in exchange for multiple life sentences. He was sentenced to 18 consecutive life terms and is currently incarcerated at New Jersey State Prison in Trenton, where he will never be eligible for parole. The case of Charles Cullen forced a seismic shift in the American healthcare system. It exposed a terrifying loophole: the lack of a mandatory, centralized reporting system for healthcare professionals suspected of wrongdoing. Because hospitals were more concerned with protecting their reputations than the public, a dangerous caregiver could simply move on to the next institution, his record clean. In the wake of the scandal, both New Jersey and Pennsylvania passed Charles Cullen laws, requiring hospitals to report and provide detailed references for any employee dismissed for incompetence or malfeasance. The case also led to stricter controls on drug dispensing cabinets and more robust oversight of medication waste. But the most enduring legacy is one of profound grief and unanswered questions. For the families of his victims, the horror was twofold. First, they learned their loved one had not died of natural causes, but had been murdered in a place of supposed safety. Second, they discovered that multiple institutions had suspected Cullen and had done nothing to stop him. Their loved ones had been sacrificed to protect a bottom line. The story of Charles Cullen is not just the story of a single, disturbed individual. It is a story about the systems that failed to catch him, the trust he so viciously betrayed, and the quiet, bureaucratic cowardice that allowed a killer to roam free for 16 years. He was a ghost in the machine of modern medicine, a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not the ones who break down the door, but the ones we already let inside. Don't be in the dark. Subscribe to my channel for more truth they don't put on the hospital brochure.